I would like to start this event by greeting our lecturer. Good morning, Dr. Hikotani, and good evening to our audience in Brazil. We are delighted to welcome to the fifth and last webinar promoted by the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas in partnership with the Japan House in São Paulo. Kindly joining us from Japan is Dr. Takako Hikotani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Columbia in New York. She has previously taught at the National Defense Academy of Japan and lectured at the Ground and Air Self-Defense Forces Staff Colleges, as well as at the National Institute for Defense Studies. Her research focuses on civil-military relations, Japanese domestic and foreign policy, and comparative civil-military relations. After the lecture on defense policymaking in Japan, we have a question and answer session of 20 minutes. Therefore, we invite the audience to send their written questions to the link made available for you during the entire presentation. It is important to note that all statements expressed by Fundação Getulio Vargas employees and guests in this event will exclusively represent their own opinions and not necessarily FGV institutional position. All present here agreed to participate and have consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be later posted on FGV's official channels. I welcome Dr. Hikotani and thank her very much for joining us. And I'll give the floor to Professor Pedro Brites. Thank you.
Thank you, Luana. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here tonight. We know that this year was a difficult year for the Academy. It represented a change in how we think about teaching, research, and of course, events in general. Tonight is the last event of our series of webinars about Japan. I want to thank everyone who supported us throughout these events, and especially the Japan House that helped to carry out this cycle. More than that, I want to thank everyone who has attended the lecture so far. And today we close this series in a very incredibly special way. We are honored to receive Dr. Takako Hikotani, who kindly accepted our invitation to be here with us. Professor Hikotani, thank you very much. I wish you all a great event.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for your kind introduction. Good evening. My name is Takako Hikotani. I currently teach at Columbia University that I am virtually in front of right now, but I'm physically in Japan right now, visiting family for the holidays. It is a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm very honored to be included in a wonderful lineup of speakers you had for this series, and I applaud the efforts of your school and Japan House and all those involved for putting together such an impressive series at this moment. As Pedro just mentioned, we're at a very unfortunate time right now that it is very difficult to travel and meet each other, but I do think that it's rather miraculous that I can visit you all sometime in this way, and hopefully have a chance to meet you in person in the future. The topic that I was asked to speak today was about defense policy making process. And I understand that your previous speakers have focused more on the regional dynamics or the policy changes that may have occurred. So I like to bring things to the more of the domestic side of the story and where that policy comes from. And I'll be trying to explain a rather complicated system that we have right now that I'm sure that not everybody in Japan quite understands either or is aware of. But I do think that there's important things about exactly the complicated nature of what we have today. So please bear with me. I think it might raise more questions than answers, but I'm looking forward to hearing your questions at the end so that I can solve or try to answer your questions as we do the Q&A session. So without further explanation, I'd like to share my screen if that's okay. Okay, so this is my slide on defense policy making in Japan. And since I can't really see you right now, I'm not too sure how much you know about the Japanese self-defense forces or what impression you might have. So one impression that people might have of the Japanese self-defense forces is that it is quite a significant force if you compare with other militaries in the world. On the upper left-hand corner, Japan dispatched support troops to Iraq. That's what you see. And that you can see the naval operations and some multilateral efforts and group pictures on the right. But at the same time, I think for Japanese public, people consider the self-defense forces to be more of actors of goodwill that come to help the people when in times of disaster. As you know, in Japan, we have a lot of earthquake and tsunami, and I'm not even sure where these pictures come from because flooding and earthquakes happen so often that this could be from any earthquake or disaster that happened in Japan. One unusual one might be the one you see on the bottom right corner, which is self-defense force personnel helping the construction of snow sculptures in Hokkaido, where we have a lot of snow. So they do some civilian support work like this too, as community outreach. So for the Japanese public, their impression of the self-defense forces might not be quite what you see in the previous slide, but something like this. And how does that affect policy? So you may have read or heard from previous lectures in this series that Japan's self-defense forces mission have been expanding. There was a cabinet decision to develop seamless secure legislation to ensure Japan's survival and protect its people, and there was a legislation for peace and security. I'll go into the details of this later. And public opinion polls have consistently showed positive impression of the self-defense forces. It is not so much that they were never popular, but right now, and in 2018, 89.8% of the public have a positive impression of the self-defense forces as opposed to 5.6. So that's very positive. And the trust of the self-defense forces compared to other occupations, to the left or in the column where self-defense forces have 60% trust, courts, police, and of course, in the ranking of do not trust, the top ranking is Diet members, which is congressmen or politicians, and the media and the bureaucrats. So you can see that relatively speaking, the self-defense force is a really trusted institution. But how does that affect the policy going forward? Does that mean that the public wants them to do more? Or how does that, how is the positive image of the self-defense force, is that a product of the changing security situation surrounding Japan? Or to what extent is that a precursor for change to happen? I would argue that because of, and in some ways, maybe you can argue, despite the popularity of self-defense forces, what I would call the 4 key long-standing pillars of defense policy, or me or my good friend and colleague, a young scholar named Adam Liff of Indiana University, mentioned in his excellent article, there's 4 key long-standing pillars of defense policy. Article 9 of the Constitution, U.S.-Japan alliance as center of Japan's national defense security strategy, and defense spending under 1%, or at least a more limited spending on defense, and no indigenous nuclear deterrent force. I believe that these 4 key long-standing pillars are more likely to continue than to change. Despite the changing security environment and despite possible changes to U.S. policy, we can talk about what would be a trigger for change, but I believe that it's more remarkable than not that despite the changes Japan faced since the end of the war in 1945, these key long-standing pillars had stood. However, I think what is worth noting is that despite the many debates about what's going to happen to these pillars, not much attention has been placed on changes that did take place in the defense policy making process, especially in the past decade. In many ways, I think the defense policy making process change was more significant in recent years than in the substance of policy. Although there was a lot of discussion about what the peace and security legislation is going to bring, I believe that the changes in the process could be more significant and would be more determinant of how exactly the legal changes would be put into practice in actual policy, as actual policy. So I talk about the changes defense policy making process and then sort of go back to reflect on the key longstanding pillars that I would go ahead and say I believe has not changed, and talk about what policy changes did take place and the crisis management going forward. What are the implications of the defense policy making process in thinking about change going forward? So what is the Article 9 of the Constitution anyway? So these are the two clauses that has not changed since the end of World War II. The first part says, aspiring sincerely to international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and threat of or use of force as a means of settling international dispute. And in some ways, the second part tends to be more controversial, that in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state would not be recognized. So you might wonder, like, didn't we just see like army-looking people or Navy ships? So how can this stand when we have what we have? So if you have that question right now, why do these provisions allow for the self-defense force to even exist? Since the end of World War II, Japan made a decision not to repeat the ravages of war, and the principle of pacifism is enshrined in the Constitution, which prescribes the renunciation of war, prohibition of war potential, and denial of right of belligerency of the state. However, of course, since Japan is an independent nation, these provisions do not deny Japan's inherent right of self-defense as a sovereign state. So the Japanese government interprets this as a constitutional right to possess the minimum armed forces needed to exercise that right, the right of self-defense as a sovereign state. So therefore, the Japan under the Constitution maintains the self-defense forces as an armed organization, holding exclusively defense-oriented policy as its basic strategy of defense, and continue to keep it equipped and ready for operation. So this comes straight from the Defense White Paper. And so this is how the wording in the Constitution and the existence of a pretty significant force in all respects, how to reconcile the two. The other aspect, which I would argue is the key pillar, is the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security with the US. And there's two parts of it, Article 5 and Article 6. And Article 1 basically says that either party in the territories under the administration of Japan, if there's an armed attack, the two countries, the US and Japan, would act to meet the common danger in accordance with its constitutional provisions and processes. So the reason why I highlighted the in accordance with the constitutional provisions and processes is that's where the previous slide comes in. So when an armed attack against either party in the territories under the administration of Japan happens, so this treaty does not kick in if it is not in the territories under the administration of Japan or under this treaty. But there's a part 6 to it, which is that the US is granted the use of its land, air, and naval forces of facilities or bases in areas in Japan. So in its simplest form, it was considered to be offering bases in exchange for protection by the US. But over the years that I would discuss later, the security treaty has been upgraded in a way that Japan does do more than just offer bases, and it's more of a treaty between the two militaries than the initial draft. But still, the wording of this exists in the way it does, and the basic provisions in this has not changed. And the Japanese public seem to prefer having the US-Japan alliance as the way to keep Japan safe. This is a result of a public opinion poll conducted by the Cabinet Administrative Office, and which shows since 1969, Japanese public has consistently supported the U.S.-Japan alliance as a means to keep Japan safe over having independent defense, or to not have alliance or just be completely pacifist, meaning not having any arms at all. So this has been a preferred mode of protection. And also, like, has there been proposals to change the Constitution? I'm sorry, this is sort of hard to read, but this is a summary of the proposal to change the Constitution. Although some have argued that the second part of the Constitution that I saw, the line starting land, sea, and air forces will never be maintained, is sort of a bit too strong a language and is not consistent with what we have. The proposal to abolish that part, which was a proposal made by the Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party in 2012, has then since been changed. And the current provision or current proposal to change the Constitution is limited to adding a clause or separate article to stipulate the constitutionality of the self-defense force, but not to change any wording in what I showed you in the previous slide. And not just that, but for the Japanese public, there isn't much support for changing the Constitution. Especially, this is asking what do you think about changing the Constitution? Although it could be any part of the Constitution, it tends to be interpreted as, do you agree changing Article 9? And you can see that in the earlier 2000s, more than 50% of the public changed some revision of the Constitution. Now there's more, although it's still contentious, there's support for revising the Constitution. And there's different ways that different newspapers ask this question, but I think overall, it does show that the Japanese public is less likely to respond positively to changing the wording of the Constitution than in the early 2000s. How about defense spending? Does the Japanese public want to spend more? So this is defense spending compared with GDP. The right scale is in the red is the percentage of GDP. And I know from your lecture series that you heard about from Professor Sahashi about China, and you must have heard a lot about the changing security situation surrounding Japan. So you might be surprised that there hasn't been a defense spending increase in a way that you might expect. And while it is true that since the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the previous Prime Minister, was elected Prime Minister in 2012, there has been increases in defense spending. And depending on how you use the vertical scale, you can see that it's a major increase, but you can see that the scale on the left actually only ranges from 4.1 for 4.0 to 5.4. So it actually is magnifying the level of change than not. And you can see that it has not increased as much as you think. I think that's a more of a fair way to look at this, although the fact that it has increased compared to previous years of decrease is quite impressive. And public opinion on defense buildup also has been more supportive of the status quo. There is an uptick, I'm sorry, the bottom disappeared, but there has been an uptick to increase, but it hasn't crossed over anyway. There's more support for the status quo. Why is that important? Why is that the case? This might have been shown to you before, but we have a major population challenge in Japan, that this is a population pyramid. And you can see that we're going to have the bottom is the younger generation. So you can see when you have, in the 1960s, we had more kids than older people. Now we have a huge population of those over the age of 65, and that's only to increase. Another way to look at this is that we can see that by 2050, the elderly population defined by those over 65 is going to get closer and closer to half of the population. So Japan is a very aging society. And partly because of that, this is the breakdown of the 2017 general account budget. By looking at expenditures, you can see how Social Security is already just about 1/3, and there's no reason why it would shrink, given that there's going to be more older people that is going to be covered by Social Security and pension. So, and compared to that, defense is 5.3%, but you can see the budgetary pressures that are there to making it difficult for Japan to increase its defense spending. Finally, how about the nuclear weapons? I'm sharing with you a survey done by an organization called Genro NPO in 2016-2017 to both Japanese and South Korean public. And although the South Korean public opinion is not directly relevant, just to show you as an example, in terms of the question on the top, which is more relevant, should Japan acquire nuclear weapons? There's 70.7% argues that they should not. And it only, and it's a slight drop from 80.3% in 2016, but you can still that there's still less than 10% that agree. And although the public opinion in South Korea is not relevant to a point, you can see that there's a lot more support for acquiring nuclear weapons in South Korea among the South Korean public, as you see in the bottom two figures. Why this constant continuity? Although it's not directly asked and it's not being conscious minds, I do think there might be one, in a way, a secret part, not a so secret, but important part of why the combination of keeping the peace constitution and limiting its defense, and at the same time, depending on the US, is an attractive option for Japan. And although it's not the entire story, I think it's very significant to note that more than 70% of bases, US bases in Japan is located in Okinawa, the Southern Islands. And this is how, how much US bases there are in the island of Okinawa. And this is Okinawa's strategic location. So it's not that all the bases are in Okinawa because it's far from Tokyo and it's not in people's backyards, but there's a strategic reason why Okinawa is important. But you can say that the fact that the bases that Japan has to cover under the treaty, the Article 6 of the treaty that I showed you, is largely invisible to the Japanese public, may have something to do with the fact that the US-Japan treaty and the cost that Japan is bearing of having bases in your vicinity is not as felt, or the presence of the US may not be as felt by the Japanese general public than you might expect. But as we shown by this slide, the Okinawa public opinion is not uniformly against, but has been split on this issue. And most recently, a governor that was opposed to the relocation of bases or reconstruction of bases to remove a helicopter airport from a very heavily densely populated area to a different part of Okinawa has been facing a lot of opposition. So just to know, this no is not for US bases at large overall in Okinawa, but just to show that the second part of the treaty obligation is concentrated in one prefecture is something that I think is worth noting about the US-Japan alliance relationship. So is there no change? I do see that until right now, the key longstanding pillars of Japan's defense policy has not changed much. And what Professor Soya of Keio University has called the Article 9 US-Japan alliance regime is still very sound. And that seems to be what the Japanese public would prepare to do instead of having more autonomous defense or getting out of the alliance or any other options that Japan might have. However, as I said, I think it's important to note that defense policy making process has changed. And this is not just a reflection of external environment. This is more a reflection of changing overall policy making process in Japan with a stronger prime minister. However, I think the relevance to defense policy is quite great. So I'd like to talk about that next and talk about defense policy change since 2013. So my area of expertise actually is civil military relations, and I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about Brazilian civil military relations, but this is a common chart that's used to explain defense policy making and also civilian control in a democracy as chain of delegation. In a presidential system, voters choose the president Congress, and through them they choose Secretary of Defense and the military. In a parliamentary system, the chain is singular. the voters vote, since voters cannot, or the general public cannot protect themselves, how do they make sure that the military protects them, but that at the same time that the military is accountable in a democratic system? The voters do not exercise oversight directly of the military, but choose the party politicians in their district to the parliament, and the parliament in a role that they have in each system, who chooses the prime minister, most likely the largest party or the leading party in a coalition comes up the prime minister, who chooses the minister of defense, and through the minister of defense, the military will become the recipient of oversight, or there will be accountability guarantee through this chain. That's what in the political science jargon called the chain of delegation. And this is not only for military affairs, this is for policy in general. But I believe that it was important to note that in the Japanese system, there was a very little, there were breaks in the system of delegation, that especially in the area of defense policy, there wasn't as much oversight of political input as much as you think. That is, I'm going to be skipping like the details of what I'm talking about, but the election system that Japan had previous to 1993 created an incentive for politicians to not focus on public policies at large, including defense policy, but on pork barrel politics, or bringing benefits to the constituents. So there was little focus on defense between among the politicians, and voters tended not to vote on defense policy. And the prime minister had a relatively weak party base, so that he wasn't really representing his party in a way that he should be, or that he didn't have that much control over his own party members. There was a lot of diversity of views among the party members. And in Japan, most of its history in the post-war era, the Liberal Democratic Party has been in power, but the prime minister has turned over very frequently. We didn't, so Prime Minister Abe was the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history, but we had prime ministers who only served for 1 year or so. And at the same time, the JDA minister, this is Japan Defense Agency, which was the precursor to Ministry of Defense, the ministers changed a lot too. And so between the politicians who became ministers, there were the Ministry of Defense bureaucrats were in charge of defense policy, but there wasn't as much oversight from the political scene as you might think, especially on day-to-day workings of defense policy. Of course, there were controversial issues that came up in defense policy discussions. The politicians would be involved, but generally speaking, since the consensus to support U.S.-Japan Security Treaty and for the Constitution is very strong, something that breaches either one created lots of controversy, and also changes to this treaty alliance relationship, even though it might be smaller, created a lot of political discussion, or led to political discussion. But generally, defense policy was not a heavily politically discussed topic as much as you might think. But now the new chain of litigation is more singular and has centered more on the prime minister. From the voters' point of view, due to changes in the electoral system, voters tend to choose the party over individual politicians, and though they are very conscious of who they're choosing as the prime minister. And partly because of that, the prime minister, being the chosen one, has more leverage over its party members. It also has more leverage over the cabinet, and also including a Ministry of Defense. And from the Ministry of Defense, there's more strengthened political leadership over the Ministry of Defense, which includes civilians and the military. So there's a more of a new chain of delegation where the prime minister is the center of decision making, and he has the more of the willingness to exercise control or to exercise political leadership. The other important factor is the establishment of the National Security Council. The National Security Council of Japan had existed in a different form, but was made much stronger in December 2013. Now, currently, the national security of Japan has 3 systems, which is in normal times, there's a bi-weekly foreign ministers meeting with the Prime Minister, Chief Cabinet Secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Defense. And in times of need, there's something called a 9-minister meeting when a self-defense force deployment is needed. And in the time of crisis, there's a ministerial emergency meeting. But the point I'd like to raise here is that in normal times, there's a bi-weekly foreign ministers meeting to discuss security policy of Japan as a normal standard operating procedure that did not exist prior to their existence. Another important factor is that there's a National Security Bureau, or the Secretariat, that runs the National Security Council of Japan, that is made up of bureaucrats from different ministries, including Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense and other ministries. But most importantly, most interestingly, for civil military relations, which includes self-defense force officers. And that is something that had not existed in the past. The other aspect that is important in accordance to National Security Council's establishment, I'm getting into the policy part of it now, is that the National Security Strategy of Japan, a new one was put into place, replacing what was called the Basic Policy for Japan's Defense. That was the basis, as you see on the right, of all the defense program guidelines or the budgeting for the length of 1954 to 2013. So the Basic Policy for Japanese Defense, which is the number 1 to 4, had not changed even a word for that long of a time. And now we have a National Security Strategy of Japan that is expected to be revised about every 10 years. And there's a discussion right now of possibly changing the National Security Strategy of Japan quite soon. So this looks more like what we have, what the US has in terms of its national security strategy. There's a definition of national interest and objectives, and it goes into the strategic approaches Japan should take for its international security. So we have a more elaborate system of national security strategy of Japan being drafted and to be revised more frequently. So there's more political input into the drafting of this over time. And this will be drafted at the National Security Council level. Another policy change that happened, or policy revision that changed, is that although the US-Japan security policy itself is still intact, there has been a drafting of the new Japan-US defense guidelines. And there's more alliance coordination that is going to take place. And I'm just showing you this chart to show you that it's not the first time that the defense guidelines was revised. And initially it happened in 1978. There was a 1997 guidelines revision, but it's the third and arguably most significant change in the US-Japan alliance, even within the wording that I showed you. And the reason for that is that after the announcement of guidelines, the Japanese Diet passed what is called the Legislation for Peace and Security. And I'm showing you an extremely wordy slide, but I'm doing this because it's complicated, but it's at least easier to be seen and read than for me to just read it out. So what the Legislation of Peace and Security is known for is that it is a revision of 10 existing laws and 1 new law. So it is a updating of existing laws, basically, and a package of the revision of 10 existing laws. But what attracted the most attention is that Japan, in addition to an armed attack situation on Japanese territory, that Japan could actually exercise what is called collective self-defense in situations threatening Japan's survival. So there is a new definition of Japan's crisis situation, in addition to armed attack situation, called situations threatening Japan's survival and situations of influence. And sorry, I'm getting into detail here, but it will all make sense in a couple of slides from now, so bear with me. So there's now a new condition for collective self-defense. That use of force is allowed only, it used to be only when an armed attack of Japan against occurred, but now there's a new provision in blue that when an armed attack against a foreign country that is in a real close relationship with Japan occurs, and as a result threatens Japan's survival and poses a clear danger to fundamentally overturn Japan's right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Obviously, against a foreign country that is in a close relationship with Japan, is the US, but it's important that this does not say just the US. So this could be another different country that is in a close relationship with Japan. But it's not just that, it is an attack against the US. Japan can exercise collective self-defense, but it also has to be in a situation that threatens Japan's survival and poses a clear danger to fundamentally overturn people's right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And some would say that this is like a slippery slope, that this provision is actually not that strict, that you can define any situation in which an attack against the US occurs, that Japan would be and should be able to exercise collective self-defense. But I think like a face value reading of this would suggest that Japan is still very restrictive in what they think that when the US use of force should and could be allowed. So this is the provision that's in place that expanded when Japan can use force. That was very significant. And yet I think there's a lot of checks on when exactly that takes place. But the takeaway from this slide is that the definition of situation, how to define what the crisis situation might be, is very important and very key in actually implementing these laws. That is, to whether a situation is a situation threatening Japan's survival or a situation of important influence. And the reason why it's important is that situation under which Japan's survival is threatened, Japan can use force, although it's permitted, although limited to the minimum extent necessary, and is only under the conditions. But it is not possible if a situation is defined as a situation with important influence in Japan's peace and security. Japan is able to provide necessary logistic support and search and rescue, but not use of force. And what exactly is a threatening situation? This is based on the Diet discussion that took place when this legislation was put in place. A foreign country that is in a close relationship is one factor, and the other poses a clear danger. But the situational assessment to be based on individual, concrete, and comprehensive consideration of intent, ability, location, and situation, scope, nature, evolution of aggressor and attack. You can see already that it's actually quite complicated. And what is an important influence situation? This is a response by Prime Minister Abe in a Diet discussion. It is not a geographical context, but it to be determined based on intent, ability, location, scope, attitude, evolution of the situation, and applicable provisions in the US-Japan security law, and blah, blah, blah. So the point to be made here is that this new legislation that we have it's under this new legislation, it's very important to know how exactly the situation is defined and how that's improved. So where does the government and the Diet come into this? So the government or the National Security Council, in the formation that I showed you, is in charge of formulating the basic response plan or supporting the Prime Minister in the drafting of the basic response plan. And by doing so, it is in charge of defining what the situation falls under the law. And after a cabinet decision on the basic response plan, which is based on the situation that is defined to be most relevant to the situation Japan is which, the Diet approves the basic plan, and by which approving what the crisis situation falls under the law. So the role of government is to designate the situation and when should the US self-defense force be used to protect the security interests of Japan and the gravity of a threat and what the US forces is expected to do, what the self-defense force is expected to do. And the possible points of Diet involvement and contention is to approve designation of situation. But under the provision of the law, in emergent situations, their approval could be exposed, that is after the fact, then ex ante, before the dispatch of self-defense forces. So although theoretically under an emergent situation that the Diet could approve later, that the government can go ahead and use force in a way that is defined by the law, they are expected to at least provide exposed approval. And that is to say that the possible points of Diet involvement and contention is actually there, and that I believe that the role of the Diet in approving the situation is very important. But one could argue also, but that the structure of the law is so complicated that what happens if the situation escalates and is now from situation survival threatening rather than important influence? Some scholars, including Professor Satoshi Mori in Japan, have called for simplifying the situation categories because it's way too complex and the situation is likely to change and require a basic plan than not. But so the complexity of the system is actually inherent in the law that calls for the role of the Diet to be involved in different points. But what I do worry about, and I've written in a different article, is that it's not clear whether the Diet members are aware of the enhanced role that they're expected to play under this new formulation. So to wrap up, the key pillars of Japan's defense policy is quite resilient, meaning the Article 9 and the US-Japan alliance as the choice for Japan's strategy going forward. But defense policy making process has changed significantly, that there's more political leadership or potential political leadership if the prime minister wants to exert leadership, centered upon the staff that he has in the National Security Secretariat. There's expected to be more enhanced democratic accountability with more inputs of the Diet expected under a new legislation when a crisis happens, and possibly greater role for self-defense board personnel within the Ministry of Defense and overall in the National Security Secretariat. And there should be implications for alliance management and crisis response going forward. So at this point, I've already spoken for 42 minutes. I think I'd like to open for questions. I'm sure that there are questions because I went quite fast, but so please ask your questions and I will try my best to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hikotani. It is a pleasure to hear your take on this matter. And to open the debate, we have selected a few questions already from the audience. And we still encourage the public to send us questions to the link. First question is, how has the ongoing nuclear development process in North Korea impacted Japanese domestic debate over the need or not to increase defense capabilities and remilitarization in Japan?
Thank you. So I did not show you, but I think one of the points that could be raised as why Japan, like somewhat a puzzling situation, is that the missiles flying from North Korea, which fortunately has not hit Japan, why it hasn't changed perception of the security threat in Japan and hence change defense policy in a way that you might think, especially on relaxing the constraints on the Constitution. And I think the answer to that is that in terms of missile defense, the defense equipment or batteries in terms of how exactly to deal with the threat is already in existence through the multiple layers of missile defense system. So it doesn't really require significant change in either the legal aspects or what kind of weapons that Japan has. And there has been a review of, you might have seen in the news, of deployment of what's called the Aegis Ashore system, which was a land-based missile defense system that Japan was planning to introduce. But due to local resistance to having that type of facility on the ground, and also some technical challenges that occurred after the decision, they're reviewing that and instead deploying more Aegis vessels in the Sea of Japan, and that's being discussed. So there has been different discussions, but since the missile threat from North Korea was not exactly something that can be dealt with in terms of increasing the defense budget in a significant manner, nor that it actually made sense to try to exit the US-Japan alliance for that matter, it has not led to significant changes in policy. However, I do think that not directly due to North Korean missiles themselves, I do think that I'm actually rather surprised that the US policy that wavered on North Korea in the past 4 years, how that has not affected Japan's trust in the US-Japan alliance, I found it quite interesting. Being based in the US, I thought that the Japanese public might feel abandoned by the US when the US president seemed to be in a very friendly relationship with the North Korean dictator when the Japan was vulnerable to North Korean missiles. But Japan, that seemed not to be the issue. So I thought the impact might be some questioning the alliance itself, or at least a little bit more worries about US willingness to protect Japan come up as a result of North Korean threat, and so far it hasn't. And I do think that if there is going to be change, it's more likely to come from China. I mean, like changes in China than from North Korea at this point, although the more immediate threat obviously is North Korea. And just to sort of add one thing that I should have highlighted more in my presentation is as my response with the North Korean question somewhat alluded to already, I believe that whether or not the changing security situation in Asia would impact or change Japan's defense policy is not sort of an Asian question for Japan. I think it has more to do with Japan's alliance relationship with the US and what the US policy in the region might be. So it will be a result of both, not just change in the region and security environment, but more important, I would argue, with what the US does in its policy in East Asia. And that might be more of a trigger for possible change if there is going to be change in Japan's defense policy.
Thank you so much, Professor. So our second question, how is Japan's Ministry of Defense staffed? Is it dominated by the military or are civilians dominant?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. So it depends on what you mean by dominant. In terms of the number, obviously the self-defense forces far outnumber the civilian and people, even in the Ministry of Defense in Tokyo, in terms of the sheer number, the uniformed personnel does outnumber the civilian personnel. However, I guess the characteristic of Japan's Ministry of Defense internal composition is that it used to be in the slide that I showed you on chain of delegation that the Ministry of Delegation civilian bureaucrats, which was very few in number, was expected to control the self-defense officers who outnumbers them on behalf of the politicians. So that's how the chain of delegation functioned. I think right now the thinking have changed, that in terms of who has more influence, that I think it's more of a working relationship between the civilians and the self-defense force officer of the three services within the Ministry of Defense than it was ever before. That it's not that the civilian bureaucrats are trying to control the military officers within the Ministry of Defense. That it's more of, some have argued, like two wheels on a wagon, that they're supposed to work together. So, and also, one last point, in terms of the number of politicians, there aren't that many political appointees in the ministry system overall in Japan, including the Ministry of Defense. So there's very few appointed or politically appointed civilians in the Ministry of Defense. It's basically those who enter the ministry by exams. That's the civilian bureaucrats. There's the career track and different tracks, and the self-defense force officers that outnumber them. And a lot of them are working for the headquarters in Tokyo. But so I guess it's not like who has more influence, but the role identity has changed from the civilian bureaucracy in charge of controlling the self-defense forces, but from them working together. So in terms of the relationship, it's should be judged more of a transactional way. That I guess the basic question of civil relations has always been who has more influence, but it's actually a lot more of a complicated relational question than it used to be before. So that's where things are.
Thank you, Professor Hikotani. Next question. Do you see Japan changing its constitution to improve military forces happening in near future to play a leader role and counterbalance China in Asia?
So as my presentation showed, I'm a lot more skeptical that would happen. And I think the momentum for changing the Constitution. There's other reasons to change the Constitution, but especially just on this Article 9, Japan needs to drop its defensive or pacifist constitution for dealing with the threat it surrounds, has gone down. And I think it's somewhat ironic that it has gone down because the success of the new legislation and the reinterpretation of the Constitution to allow for limited collective self-defense to upgrade the alliance relation to the US diminished the need of Japan, or at least in the previous administration, the desired hope of the administration to update Japan's defense capabilities, that the changes that they made through reinterpretation diminished the need for changing the Constitution itself. That it was those who argued for the need to change the Constitution for Japan to do more or to relax itself of its constraints kind of got what they needed to accomplish that through the reinterpretation and the legislation. So in a way, the success of that made it, especially for those who wanted to change the Constitution for pragmatic reasons, for defense reasons, they see the cost to be less because it was accomplished through reinterpretation and not outright changing the Constitution. And right now, although there might be constitutional change, as I showed you, what it's calling for right now is just to add the current plan, existing standing plan by the Liberal Democratic Party, is just to add a clause that says that the self-defense force member is constitutionally sound, but not to drop the two parts of the Constitution that I showed you. So even if there is a revision, it's not going to be completely changing Japan's basic posture on defense policy as enshrined in the Constitution. So that's where we are. So of course I might prove to be wrong, but I just don't see any appetite for changing the Constitution as you might expect, given the changing security situation.
Perfect. Next one, how has the Trump administration foreign policy profile impacted defense policy in Japan? Is it possible to observe any effect?
Yes, so as I mentioned in the question about North Korea, I personally thought, and maybe it's because I teach at what President Trump called a liberal disgraceful institution that is right behind me, that I was more critical of the foreign policy attitudes of Trump administration. But I thought there could be little more, despite the really positive relationship between the Prime Minister and President Trump, that the Japanese public will be more worried about the credibility of the alliance during the rather volatile Trump administration. But I think from the polls that I see, although President Trump was not that popular compared to previous presidents, still in terms of, especially among the foreign policy elite, they tended to prefer Trump policy being more stronger and on China than previous administrations or previous democratic administrations. So there was a more appreciation of the strong stance of China on China by the US overall. And of course, one can argue whether the Trump administration was actually that strong on China, or that whether it's a Trump administration thing or overall US administration's policy towards China becoming more hawkish than before. I think that, and that's more of a bipartisanship. I do think that there could have been more worries about the instability of the administration, but I think the stronger stance on China sort of outweighed the concern, and that especially among the foreign policy elite, there was much more sense of comfort by the fact that US was aware of the security threat of China than otherwise. And that I think the opinion is rather relatively split, but recently there was an opinion poll that came out that asked a generational question, and the younger generation in Japan seemed to support President Trump over the older generation. And why that's the case is something that is to be asked. And as we are going to be working with the Biden administration, it's sort of a historical thing to, or it's approaching a historical precedent to approach. But I think that it's interesting that generally speaking, Japan wanted a US that was strong on China, and that's what President Trump delivered. And that is something that the Japanese public seemed to appreciate in the past 4 years. So we'll see what happens in the next 4 years.
Thank you, Professor. Another one. How does the behavior of China's recent investments in defense policy affect Japanese people's opinion in the possibility of changes in Japan defense policy?
Thank you. So I guess I didn't raise it in the slide, but I'm expecting that you will be puzzled that there isn't more of a response. And I think that more so than the missiles being shot towards Japan, that you may wonder why Japan's not investing more in defense. And I think part of the answer might have been already provided by my friend Ryo Sahashi, who I understand gave a talk, if I'm correct, that I think the relationship between Japan and China is a lot more complex. That because Japan cannot move out of the region, and Japan has been living or existed next to China for its thousands of years of history, that in the end, although Japan needs to defend itself, it also has to coexist with China. And in so doing, I do think that there is still a general consensus that the way to go is to try to work through the US-Japan alliance to keep itself secure. And so although you might be surprised, it's not that nothing has changed. And I showed you the trajectory of defense budget. There's so many different ways to draw that. And of course, you can point to the different types of battery that Japan has. You can argue the possible purchase of 2 Aegis ships is not really about North Korea, but to China. I think there has been revamping, and there has been shifts that's occurring in terms of relocating some of the ground forces to the north, to the west, southwest. That is clearly more awareness of China. But the bigger picture that I wanted to suggest for Japan, what is not changing is not the basic contours of Japan's defense policy in terms of the constitution and the strengthening of the US-Japan alliance to be the best way to go forward is it's not likely to change. And whether that's a good thing for Japan is something that we all need to think about in Japan. Whether or not the US is going to have a common interest with Japan, depending on what China does, is there at a point where Japan needs to be worried that the US will be too hawkish on China or too worried about China's what they're doing in South Korea, South China Sea or whatnot? Is the Japan and US interests always aligned in whatever regional contingency that might occur in the future? I think that's very much key. And I think for that reason, I think there should be a rethinking, not completely abolishing the alliance or anything, but what other options Japan might have going forward is very important. But of the options that Japan seems to have right now, I think the basic contours are going to remain the same. And for reasons in terms of the budgetary constraints that I suggested, I don't really see that the Japanese defense budget itself, if you see that as a change, is likely to be increased that significantly in the near future.
Thank you, Professor. We will now take the last question of the event. How do you see the future of Japan-South Korea relations as the Biden presidency might increase attention to US alliances?
Thank you. Thank you for the extremely difficult question at the end. It used to be that a realist would argue, or realists in general argue, that the imperatives of the alliance relationship between Japan and US and South Korea and the US is so strong that the Japan and South Korea, despite the historical difficulties and despite the domestic disputes, the alliance relationship is going to be sort of virtually it's going to be there because of the bilateral treaty alliances that Japan and South Korea has with the US. I'm not too sure if that's going to be any guarantee of the bilateral relationship going forward, and I think it has a lot to do with not the bilateral relationship itself, but South Korea's relationship with China and how that might differ from Japan's relationship with China, as well as South Korea's relationship with the US. So I'm at least hopeful that the US administration, or the incoming administration, will be more conscious of the importance of the bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea going forward. that hopefully, since the security imperatives suggested it's more logical than not for Japan and South Korea to have a better relationship, that would override the other issues that exist. But I am also aware of the difficulties Japan and South Korea faces, both for its domestic audience and whatnot, that makes it very difficult for pragmatic ideas to overcome the historical difficulties that both countries face. But so I'm hopefully, but I hope that the next generation, there is so many good reasons for the bilateral relationship to improve, and there's so much similarities in the culture that I wish that they will override the difficulties. But I do, and but I do hope that, generally speaking, the next administration, as the question came from, since they'll be more attentive to its allies, that there will be more working from the U.S.-Japan, the U.S. side, that would lead to more positive functional relationship between Japan and South Korea.
Once again, we thank Professor Hikotani and our audience. We are now heading to the end of the event, and I invite Professor Pedro to close it. And I wish all a good night.
Thank you very much, Luana. Professor Hikotani, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very enlightening. Once again, I want to thank you for accepting our invitation. It was an honor. And thank once again to Japan House São Paulo for all the support, the School of International Relations of FGV. Thanks to everyone who attended the event. Happy holidays to everyone. A great night for all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.